I want to just begin by just telling you an experience I had a number of years ago. I was the seminary president of a school in Canada, and over the years, I would have various students come to me. They'd make an appointment, come to my office, and then they would excitedly share the vision or the dream they had that they believed God had authored. And they would share these documents that would describe the church plant they were going to begin, or the new ministry that would reach a group of people that no one was reaching. And it would always be innovative and cutting edge and different than any other church plant had been before, and so on. And they would always be very excited and passion-filled. And I would take their documents that they left with me, and I would file them away in what I called a dream file. Dreams that people had felt that God had given them, and now theirs was the task of pursuing it and making it a reality. And over the course of the time I was at the seminary, that file got so thick, I actually had to start a second file of dreams. And so years later, when I was going to now leave the seminary and I was actually going to move to South Carolina, I began to sort out all the papers and things that I was going to have moved all the way from Canada to the South. And I came across those files. And I had this kind of sobering thought for a moment, and that is that I knew that a number of those dreams had never become a reality. That some of those church planners had gathered a team and cast the vision, and then within a year or so, it had all fallen apart. They'd grown discouraged, and they'd packed up and moved on. And that was never going to happen now. And I had this kind of morbid thought to think, well, if I'm paying per pound to move things that far, I might as well not pay to move dreams that never became a reality. So I pulled out the first dream file and began just looking at each one. And each dream that I knew was no longer in action, in motion, I would put into my garbage can. Before very long, the garbage can was overflowing. And I had to actually go to my kitchen and get a large garbage bag. And I began just to put the dreams in there. By the time I emptied the second file, this garbage bag was pretty full. And as I looked at that garbage bag of dreams, it was such a sobering moment. And I had to think to myself, every person that shared this with me was convinced God had given them this dream. And they were excited about how the world was going to be a better place because they were going to make this dream that God had given them into a reality. But now it was not going to be so. In fact, many of those young pastors and dreamers had already moved on from even considering the ministry at all, and were now doing something entirely different. And as I looked at dream after dream that had hit the garbage bin, I couldn't help but think to myself, what would America be like today? What would the kingdom of God be like today if every person who felt they had a dream given to them by God had stuck with it in faith and perseverance until it had become a reality? How many more churches would there be across America today if every dream God had given a church planter had become a reality? But alas, as you know, many of those dreams never do. And your job as associational missionaries is to walk alongside pastors and help nurture and steward their dreams until they become a reality. As you work with people who come to revitalize churches and their passion is to turn a dying church around to make it healthy again, or a church planter who comes into a new community and wants to establish a vibrant, growing church, or various people who want to minister in some way, perhaps doing outreach or ministry to youth or college students. But you know as well as I do that so many of those who start out so passionately end up discouraged. You probably have been to a number of services where a new pastor has arrived for his first Sunday and he's preaching his visionary sermon. And of course, those sermons are always filled with visions of what God is going to do, and excitement and anticipation and hope. And you also walk with some of those as they resign in discouragement, sometimes before they even have anywhere else to go. And I want to talk to you today about just what it is like to thrive in the midst of famine. When famine strikes, can you still hold on to the dream? Can you still persevere even when it seems as if everything is going against you? And there's a wonderful passage in Genesis chapter 12 that's very familiar to us, but I read it again, and especially the latter half of that chapter is a part of the chapter I've not really focused on very much before. And I want to just walk you through very quickly this chapter and point out a couple of things I think that are very important for you and for me as we minister in this very challenging time. And so Genesis 12, beginning of verse 1, it says, "The Lord said to Abram, go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Of course, a very unorthodox vision. In that day and age, you didn't leave your family and relatives. They were your only security. And it certainly was very tenuous, and that God doesn't even tell Abraham where they're going. He just says, follow me, and I'll show you where to go. And he goes on to say in verse 2, "I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great." In other words, I will grow your character. I'll tell you what, the best way to grow your character is to obediently go where God tells you to go, as frightening as it might be, as your heart is racing and you aren't sure how it's going to work out, but you know in your heart God has said, I've got a dream for you. I've got an assignment, a purpose, a mission for you. And he says, "I will bless you. I will make your name great. And you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now you notice in just two verses, verses 2 and 3, the word for blessing is used 5 times. There's no doubt what's on God's heart. What God is saying is, Abram, if you will follow the mission I have, the dream that I'm giving you, people are going to be blessed. Can I tell you, every time a child of God fulfills God's purpose for them, others are blessed as a result. But the flip side is also true. Whenever you give up on a dream, whenever you say that it's impossible, I was once excited about what God had for me, but no longer, those who would have been blessed won't be now, at least not by you and not by the dream that God gave you. And that's why it's so important that we nurse those dreams and those visions that come from heaven until we see them become a reality. I'm not telling you that you need to dream up your own dreams and then stick with them until God blesses them. But when God places his vision on your life and on your heart, and he says, if you'll simply do what I tell you, people are going to be blessed. You have to hold on to that until it becomes a reality. So in verse 4 it says, "So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him." Of course, that's an addition to the dream. God never told Abram to bring Lot with him. I think he was trying to be a good uncle, a nice person. But of course, every time you add to God's vision, there's complications. There's often a cost to pay, a price to pay. And I've often seen people that God had given them a vision. God did have some specific things he wanted to do, but then we began adding to the vision. We thought, well, since we're going to do this anyway, why don't we do this? And this would be a good thing. And these people want to work with us. And before long, the vision God has given us has grown. And of course, Lot is going to cause Abram a lot of difficulty in the promised land. But nonetheless, it says that Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. And of course, he's 75 years old. I take great comfort in the fact that God has done some of his best work with senior adults. You know, I was a young man once, and there was a time when people used to say to me, "Richard, you're so young to be a pastor," or "You're so young to have a doctor's degree," or "You're so young to be leading a seminary." I haven't had anyone say I'm too young or so young for a long time now. But can I tell you something? A little while ago, a year or so ago, I turned 60. And that's a sobering decade to be entering. But a lot of people retire in that decade. But, you know, as I prayed about that, I really felt as if God said to me, "Richard, your 60s ought to be the most fruitful, productive decade you've ever had. You know more about the Bible, you know more about God than you ever have. You've read more Christian books, you know more theology, you have more contacts, you've had more experiences, you've had more prayers, you've had more answers to prayer than you've ever had. And now with all of that accumulated experience and wisdom and knowledge of God, you ought to be experiencing and producing more fruit than you ever have." And so I'm certainly praying for that. And when I read about God coming to Moses at age 80 or Abraham at 75 and doing the greatest work by far, as I tell you, in the time in which we live, If you are beginning to ripen in age, you're not a young man necessarily anymore. But my goodness, every time you preach or teach or counsel, there ought to be more fruit than there's ever been, because God's invested more in your life than he ever has before. And so Abram at 75 sets out, and it says he took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem at the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And you know, I love the picture here. For one thing, remember that Abram's father Terah had set out years before to go to Canaan, but he never made it. He had a dream as well of going to Canaan, but somewhere along the line that dream died on Terah. And now, by the grace of God, God came to his son Abram and said, "Now let me show you, I'm going to take you to a land." And lo and behold, it was the very land that his father had always dreamed of getting to. And I can only imagine as Abram first entered into Canaan, thinking to himself, Dad always dreamed of coming to this place. What would Dad think if he saw me now coming into this place? And oftentimes I've discovered that what the previous generation failed to trust God for, the previous generation knew the need, knew what God wanted to do, and yet somewhere along the line they just began to see it as impossible. God will come to the next generation and say, "Will you trust me? Would you let me do with you what I would have done with your fathers?" And so Abram gets into Canaan, and he moves all the way down to Shechem, which is about in the middle of the promised land. And it says there he met God, and he built an altar. And my dad would call this a spiritual marker. He set up a stone altar so that every time he came back to that site, he could remember the encounter he had with God. There God told him, "All of this land I'm going to give to you." Of course, it was a huge dream, absolutely impossible without God's help. But there Abram had that promise and that encounter with God. He built an altar so that if times ever became difficult later, he could go back and remember the moment that God spoke to him. And then it says he went on down from there, he moved onto the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. He built an altar to the Lord there, and he called on the name of the Lord. So step by step, Abram is occupying and traversing the territory God has promised him. God said, "I'm going to give you this land." And now step by step, Abram will move a little bit further, and he'll build another altar, and he'll seek God again. "God, are we on track still? God, is this what you meant? Is this where you want me to go?" And he'll hear from God, and God will assure him and affirm his direction. And then verse 9, it says, "And Abram journeyed by stages to the Negev." So he enters from the north, and he's going to make his way all the way to the south, in stages, not quickly necessarily, not all at once, but each stage, each step, it appears that he's staying in tune with God. He's recalibrating. He's making sure that everything is good. And so for the first 9 verses, Abram is doing everything that you would hope. And that seems to be the pattern that God intended for Abram. Just follow me step by step, stage by stage. Keep checking with me. Keep worshiping with me. Keep listening to me. And I will unfold everything I have for you. The dream I've given you will eventually become a reality. But then you get to verse 10. "There was a famine in the land. And so Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while." In this day and age, famines were devastating. There were no food supplies. There were no food banks. There was no government assistance. If a famine struck, you would literally could starve to death. It was disastrous. And the typical response for people was to look for a place there was food. And of course, Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. Egypt's irrigation system was provided by the Nile River that would overflood every spring. And so Egypt didn't require rain. Even if it wasn't raining, the Nile River would provide the agricultural moisture that was needed. And so it always had bread and wheat and grain, even when most of the rest of the world did not. It was considered common sense. If you have a famine, head to Egypt. That's what everybody did. And so with Abram, when the famine strikes, he does what everybody does. It's worldly wisdom at its best. Now, I don't know why God allows famines. Abram's been doing everything God said. Abram's been making progress, moving in the direction God's asked him to. Why would God bring a famine to someone who's been obeying God perfectly? But of course, God said, I'm going to make your name great. And oftentimes your character isn't grown when everything is going just as you wanted it to. Our characters tend to grow in famine, in difficulty, in crisis. God was going to do a lot more than just give Abram descendants. He was also going to make Abram a friend of God, someone that would be a pattern, a model for the people of faith for generations to come. And so God allows a famine. I can't tell you how confusing this has been, and I know you have walked with pastors and leaders who started a church, who stepped out in faith, who moved from where they lived to a new location. They came to revitalize the church, and the very people that they were trying to help turned on them and resisted them and criticized them when they wanted to change something. It can be a famine. Once you obey God, then the famine comes. We understand if you disobey God and difficulties arise, that we expect that. That's what comes from disobedience. But when you obey God, why does he allow a famine to strike? And it says that he just immediately decided the best thing was to go to Egypt. He's using worldly wisdom at this point. You'll notice that this is the first time a major move takes place, and you don't hear of Abram building an altar or seeking God. In fact, the entire time Abram is in Egypt, you never hear of him talking with God, never building an altar in Egypt, consulting with an altar before going to Egypt. It's as if Abram said, listen, as long as things are going well, God, I'm happy to let you set the directions. But as soon as there are problems, I'm taking the wheel. I'm going to have to make the decisions. God, this is too complicated, too difficult to trust you to guide me through this part. I'll take over. And he says, I'll go down to Egypt for a while. In other words, I don't plan on this being a long detour, just long enough. And of course, what begins as a detour can become a life sentence for some. It's interesting as you watch Abram kind of making those excuses. God never told him to go to Egypt. God told him to go to the Promised Land. And now Abram is choosing to leave the Promised Land. Have you ever used human reasoning to get you out of God's will? It made perfect sense. I mean, you needed to earn some money. You needed to gain more people. You needed to somehow salvage this church plant or this church revitalization. And so at some point, we stepped in and used human reasoning, when up to that point, we'd just been following God step by step. And I'll tell you what, it's been the death knell of many a dream from God when we begin to put our hands on the dream and say, this is so complicated, I better take care of this part myself. And so he goes to Egypt for a while, he says, because the famine in the land was severe. And when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. They will kill me, but let you live. Please say you're my sister, so it will go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account. I'll tell you what, this is one of the lowest points in Abram's character. At this point, he's operating out of fear rather than out of faith. And you can always tell, the moment that you are motivated by fear or by guilt, you know that God's no longer the one setting the agenda for your work and ministry. God's never going to motivate you to work out of fear. He wants you to operate out of faith. But now Abram's character has been exposed in all of its ugliness. You notice the pronouns he uses, that they're going to kill me. You need to do this to protect me. Sarai, lie about who you are and make yourself vulnerable to be taken into the Pharaoh's harem. You may have it really rough, but at least it will save me. Very selfish, self-centered, fearful, and faithless response to the problems that he faced. And so they do go down, and it says that when they entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh. So the woman was taken to Pharaoh's household. He treated Abram well because of her, and Abram acquired flocks and herds, male and female donkeys, male and female slaves, and camels. It's ironic, is it not, that when Abram gets out of God's will, he prospers materially. He does quite well financially. The problem is his wife does terribly. The Pharaoh and the Egyptians do terribly. Everybody suffers because Abram is out of God's will, except in this case, Abram. He actually gets rich. Tragically, you never see Abram finally just feeling guilty and saying, my goodness, every time I walk by Pharaoh's harem, I'm convicted. My wife's in there somewhere trying to fend off Pharaoh, and here I am getting richer by the week. He's not going to change his approach until finally Pharaoh comes to realize what's happening, and he finally puts a stop to it. He's just quietly just enjoying all the riches he has and forsaking his own wife and letting Pharaoh and the Egyptians suffer from all kinds of terrible plagues that they're suffering. And you can just see the shallowness at this point of Abram's character. He's taken his eyes off of God. He's trying to just work out the problems the best way that he knows how. I remember years ago being in a meeting, and after the meeting that evening, a pastor asked me to spend some time with him, and so I went for dinner with him. We went to a restaurant, and I said, tell me what's going on in your church. And he literally took an hour to tell me what was going on in his church, and it was all bad. He told me about a youth pastor that he was going to need to fire, told me about a worship pastor that was giving him grief, told me about some deacons that he was in conflict with. He told me about the economy that was hurting his church. He told me about government leaders that were passing some rules and bylaws that were going to hurt his ministry. And for an hour, he just kept unloading all of his frustrations about everything that other people were doing, and then how he was trying to respond to that. And after an hour, I've eaten my entire entree. I'm eyeing up the dessert menu, and this pastor, finally, his food is getting cold in front of him, and so he says, well, wouldn't you be frustrated if this was your church? And I prayed, as I know many of you have had a similar experience and conversation, and finally I just said, can I tell you something? I said, I asked you what was going on in your church, and you've taken about an hour to give me great detail about what you see. But I said, what strikes me is that in an hour of talking about what's happening in your church, you have not mentioned God one time. Clearly, his focus was all on people, on frustrations, on what he was upset about, what he was fearful about, but he lost sight of God. He was trying to manage the problems in his church in his own strength, and it was destroying him, and it was destroying his church. And here Abram has tried to solve the problem in his own strength, with his own wisdom, and it's made life worse for everybody. And finally, Pharaoh comes to him and says, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me? She was your wife. Why did you say she's my sister? Isn't that terrible when a secular world is criticizing the church and God's people for the way that they're living? Because they view the church, they view God's people as actually bringing harm to them rather than blessing. God had intended for Abram to be a conduit of blessing everywhere he went, but he hasn't been a blessing to Egypt. He hasn't been a blessing to his wife. And now he's being condemned by the very people that he should have been a blessing to. And so Abram packs up all of his possessions and his wife, and he heads back north, back to the promised land, where God had told him to go all along. And what's interesting, if you continue reading into chapter 13, Abram goes back to Bethel, goes back to the very altar, the last place that he heard from God, the last place where his focus was on God, where he was still in God's will. And he makes his way back to that place. And you probably have done as I have, where you've had to walk with people when they realize they got off track. They got their eyes off of where it should have been. And they look around and say, how did I get here? How did my life and ministry get here? That first Sunday that I preached at my church and cast the vision of what God was going to do, and now here I sit, discouraged and losing all hope and all sense of God's blessing on my ministry. How could I have ever gotten to this place? But fortunately, God is a God of grace. And the moment Abraham determines to go back to where God intended for him to be, he makes his way back to Bethel. There's many a church minister who needs to make their way back to Bethel. They found themselves lost somewhere in Egypt, as they began to try to take matters into their own hands. But they've made their way back. I'll never forget going to a Southern Baptist convention with my father one time. And it was always such a joy just to hang out with my dad, and just this stuff happened the whole time. You just sat there and just watched God work. And I remember a man came up to him, took him by the hand. He said, "Henry, you don't know me," he said, "but years ago, I was a young pastor, and I went to my first church, and I began to try to do what God was leading me to do, and to make some necessary changes and try to make the church better." And he said a group within the church, deacons, resisted that. They decided to fire me. They sent me packing with no severance, no insurance, booted me out of the parsonage, and my family and I had to struggle just to survive. He said it was the most hurtful, painful thing. He said I had a friend that had started up a new company, and he invited me to come and be his executive vice president. And I went to that company, and the company did very well. I made a lot of money. And for several years, I just thought to myself, I'm so glad to be done with that ministry and all the hard work involved with that. But he said in the church I was attending, he said they decided to go through experiencing God. And as I was going through experiencing God, I began to look at my spiritual markers. And I saw how God had called me to be a pastor, how God had given me a vision of what he wanted to do through my life. And at that point, he couldn't talk anymore. You could tell he was fighting back tears. He was about to just begin weeping. And he just stopped and he said, "I just want you to know I'm a pastor again." He'd made his way back to Bethel. He'd gotten back to the last thing he knew God had called him to do. And he was back in place. And of course, when you get to chapter 13 of Genesis, there's that beautiful story where Abram and Lot now, they're shepherds, their hired men are having conflicts because there's too many of them for the pasture land and the water. And so Lot, of course, as the ungrateful nephew, should have submitted to his uncle and let his uncle choose the choice land, the land over by Sodom and Gomorrah, rather than the desert in the Negev. But by this point, Abram's not living in fear anymore. Abram now has trusted God, that I can trust, if I've got God, I can thrive in a desert just as well as in a lush valley land. And so he tells Lot, you pick, you take what you want. Of course, Lot selfishly takes the attractive land, the land with the grass and the pasture land, and Abraham makes his way into the desert. But now he's learned a valuable lesson in Egypt, and that is, if you've got God, you can thrive in a desert. When you don't have God, you're in trouble even in a valley full of lush pastures. And so Abram now has learned his lesson. He's moved on. That famine that struck him took him to the very depths, exposed the ugliness of his character, the weakness of his faith. But he came out of it a different man. It's interesting, isn't it, that Isaac will also endure a famine. And when he begins to contemplate going to Egypt, God actually intervenes and says, don't go to Egypt. It didn't go well for your dad there. Don't go there. Jacob will suffer a famine and take ultimately all of his sons into Egypt, where they'll spend the next 400 plus years. Famines seem to be a part of each of the patriarchs' life. They're a time of testing, of revealing what their faith really looks like. And so when you walk alongside a pastor or someone who's in the midst of a famine, opposition, criticism, difficulty, they're going to, of course, ask God, why would a loving God let me go through this? I thought I was doing what you wanted me to do. I came to this church. I'm doing what you've called me to do. I'm trying to follow through with the dream you've given me. But with every dream, it seems, will be at some point tested by a famine. And what they do, how they handle that, will determine whether they ever see the fulfillment of that dream. I want to encourage you as you walk alongside the pastors and leaders in your associations. God has given many of them a dream, a vision of what he could do. But famines are going to come, and those young men and women are going to be struggling as they find their assignments that God gave them to be under attack, and things drying up and withering up around them. And in that moment, you may need to come alongside them and say, listen, I know you might be tempted just to boot it down to Egypt, but keep your eye on God. He's still at work. This isn't the end of the story. This isn't the final chapter. Don't make choices now the world's ways that you'll regret later. Live your life in faith so that everyone around you continues to be blessed, because you kept your eyes on God and you didn't forsake the dream and race toward Egypt. Well, you've got, these are challenging times to lead. And as you walk with leaders, you need to do so in wisdom with the Word of God, keeping people's eyes on God and not on the famine. I pray that God will use you mightily in the days to come as you serve Him as faithfully as you always do.